For years, when we talked about making buildings greener, the big focus was, well, mostly on how much energy they'd use once they were built, the heating, cooling, lights, that sort of thing.
With operational side.
Exactly. But a pretty significant shift is happening globally. There's this growing understanding, I think, that we've got to look way beyond just those day-to-day energy bills.
Uh-huh.
We need to consider the total carbon footprint of our buildings. And especially now, with energy costs kind of bouncing around and everyone feeling the pinch, there's a real urgency to, well, get a handle on this.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what this concept of whole life carbon, or WLC, is really all about.
WLC, okay.
It's essentially taking a step back and accounting for all the greenhouse gas emissions tied to a building, throughout its entire existence.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So for this deep dive, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what whole life carbon actually means, and maybe more importantly, why it's become such a critical piece of the climate puzzle. We've got a really insightful set of sources here. The main one is an OECD report called Zero Carbon Buildings in Cities.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
And this isn't just some theoretical paper.
Yeah.
It's based on a global survey and discussions with the folks who are actually making and shaping policy experts and policymakers.
And it had support from Japan's Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, and the Building Center of Japan, too. So, quite comprehensive.
Right.
This OECD report, it's a fantastic snapshot of where the world stands on this issue right now. Our goal today is to really dig into its key findings.
Okay.
We want to understand what different cities and countries are actually doing with WLC policies, what roadblocks they're hitting, the innovative solutions they're exploring, and, the big picture recommendations for the future. We're aiming to give you a clear, sort of no-nonsense understanding of this complex area without getting totally lost in the technical weeds.
Exactly. So let's jump right in. Why is this whole life carbon conversation gaining so much traction right now? What's the big urgency?
Well, like you said, for a long time, the climate conversation around buildings was really laser-focused on those operational emissions, the energy needed just to keep a building running day to day.
Yeah.
But the emissions that happen before the building even opens its doors, that's the embodied emissions.
Ah, right. The materials, construction.
Exactly. Manufacturing materials like concrete and steel, transporting them, the construction process itself, and even what happens when the building is eventually taken down. Those have largely been, well, overlooked in climate policy.
Overlooked.
You could say they've been a bit of a blind spot.
A blind spot, huh? It's kind of surprising, isn't it, that such a big chunk of the picture wasn't getting the attention it deserved. Why was that, do you think?
Well, what's fascinating here is that as technology and regulations have pushed us towards more energy-efficient buildings, and we've made good progress there,
Sure.
those operational emissions have started to decrease quite significantly in new builds, which means the embodied emissions, that initial carbon footprint from making the building, now make up a much larger slice of a building's total environmental impact over its life.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So even if we're building these incredibly energy-efficient structures that sip electricity, if the stuff they're made from and the way they're put together is super carbon intensive, we're still not really solving the whole problem, are we?
Precisely.
It's like, I don't know, focusing on a car's fuel efficiency, but completely ignoring the massive emissions from actually building the car in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the report actually projects that within the next 10 years or so, embodied emissions could account for around half of the total emissions from new buildings.
Half.
Half. That's a massive shift in perspective.
Wow, half. That really puts things in perspective. And it's not as if we're hitting pause on construction globally, right? I mean, the demand for new buildings is just huge.
Absolutely not. The scale is incredible. Between 2010 and 2020, the amount of new built-up area worldwide was equivalent to the entire landmass of Austria.
Austria. Good grief.
And the projections are quite staggering. By 2030, we're expecting to build a new area the size of Paris. Every single week.
Wait, say that again?
A new Paris.
Every week.
Okay, a Paris a week. That's a mind-blowing statistic. It really drives home the urgency, especially, I guess, in those rapidly growing areas you mentioned.
Exactly. This is particularly critical in rapidly urbanizing regions like Africa, where the need for new buildings, new infrastructure, is set to explode. Let that sink in for a moment, a Paris a week. The sheer scale of construction really underscores the urgency of tackling embodied carbon now.
So it's not just about chipping away at emissions here and there. It's about the sheer volume of new construction happening. It's overwhelming.
Exactly. And focusing on reducing embodied emissions isn't just about tackling climate change directly, though that's obviously key. There are some significant knock-on benefits, too.
Like what? Well, like using our natural resources more wisely, encouraging the reuse and recycling of building materials, what we call a more circular approach.
Right, circular economy.
And it spurs innovation within the construction industry itself, finding new materials, better processes.
Okay, so we've laid out why this whole life carbon thing is so important, why it's urgent. Now let's look at the bigger picture. Is this just a niche topic for experts, or is it getting broader attention on a global scale?
No, there's definitely a growing wave of global momentum. We're seeing it mentioned at high
Oh,
levels.
yeah.
For instance, the G7 Sustainable Urban Development Ministers communique in 2024 specifically addressed the importance of whole life carbon in buildings.
Okay, G7 level.
And similarly, the Shilat Declaration from the Buildings and Climate Global Forum, which brought together ministers from over 60 countries, also put a significant emphasis on this. So it's clearly on the radar at a high political level now.
So it's being discussed by the people who make big decisions. That's definitely a positive sign. What about the financial world? Is whole life carbon starting to play a role in how investments are made? Money talks, right?
Yes, it is increasingly. Sustainable finance is taking whole life carbon into account, particularly through the reporting of what are known as Scope 3 emissions.
Scope 3, remind us what those are.
Think of these as the indirect emissions that a company is responsible for, both up and down its value chain. So not just their direct operations, but their supply chain, the use of their products,
Got it.
and the embodied carbon in the buildings they finance or develop absolutely falls under that umbrella. By looking at whole life carbon, investors get a much more complete picture of a building's true environmental footprint, its climate risk profile.
That makes sense. If the financial world starts paying serious attention to the full carbon story, it creates a real incentive for developers to choose lower carbon options, doesn't it?
It really does.
So what about actual government policies? Are we seeing any concrete regulations being put in place beyond just high-level declarations?
Absolutely. The European Union's revised Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, the EPDD, is a really significant piece of legislation here.
Ah, yes, the ATPD.
Its main goal is obviously improving energy efficiency across the EU, but the revised version includes a clear roadmap with requirements for carbon assessment.
Okay, assessments are coming in.
These assessments will need to be disclosed through energy performance certificates, those EPCs you see,
Right.
for large buildings starting in 2028. And importantly, the directive also emphasizes the importance of social fairness, ensuring a just transition.
So it's not just about cutting carbon, but also about making sure the shift is equitable. That seems like a really crucial point.
It is. And what's also really interesting is the EU taxonomy.
The classification system.
Exactly. It defines what counts as sustainable economic activities. And it now includes specific technical screening criteria related to whole life carbon for both new construction and major renovations.
What kind of criteria?
Things like setting limits on the use of primary raw materials, so virgin materials, and establishing targets for the reuse and recycling of construction and demolition waste.
Yeah.
So they're not just talking about it, they're setting actual benchmarks.
Setting those concrete thresholds sounds like it could really drive change. Gives everyone something clear to aim for.
Exactly. And to get a broader sense of what's happening globally, the OECD conducted that global survey on whole life carbon of buildings we mentioned earlier.
Right, the survey.
This survey was designed to understand, what goals countries and cities have for WLC policies, the tools they're using, what's helping them succeed, how different levels of government are working together or maybe not working together, and crucially, what challenges they're facing.
And what were some of the main hurdles that came up in that survey, both for actually creating these policies and for putting them into practice on the ground?
Well, when it came to developing the policies themselves, a few things came up repeatedly. Respondents often mention the difficulty of setting appropriate reference points, benchmarks, and actual limits for emissions. That's tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine what's good look like.
Precisely. Then there's the challenge of creating reliable and comprehensive databases of environmental information for all the different building materials out there.
The data problem. Always the data problem.
Always. Plus, the need for close collaboration with the construction industry. You need their buy-in. You need to know it's feasible. And also aligning national policies with international efforts, so you're not reinventing the wheel or creating conflicting rules.
Okay, those sound like pretty fundamental challenges, building the foundations. What about the difficulties in actually implementing these policies once they're written?
Yeah, the implementation side has its own set of issues. Key challenges reported include the sheer additional workload for everyone involved, architects, engineers, contractors, to actually conduct these whole life carbon assessments.
More paperwork, more analysis.
Right. Then there's a lack of readily available environmental product declaration data EPDs for many building materials. We'll probably talk more about EPDs.
Okay.
There's also a shortage of professionals who actually have the expertise to conduct these assessments properly. It's a relatively new field for many.
The skills gap.
Exactly. And finally, the increased responsibilities placed on local authorities to oversee and enforce these new requirements. They need resources too.
Yeah.
So it's clear that building capacity and improving access to reliable data are absolutely critical for successful implementation.
So it seems like there's a significant learning curve involved and a real need for better data infrastructure and more trained professionals right across the board. Okay, let's get into some specific examples now. What kind of regulatory measures are different places actually putting in place?
The report highlights several really interesting approaches. Greater London in the UK, for instance, has made whole-life carbon reporting mandatory for larger new developments, what they call referable developments.
Mandatory reporting in London, how does that work?
They have a phased submission process. So developers need to provide WLC information at different stages: pre-application, planning stage, and then post-construction.
Ah, so they track it through the project.
Exactly. And they ask for specific details, like what percentage of any existing structures on the site will be retained or reused, and a clear outline of the key actions being taken to minimize the whole life carbon emissions. It's quite a comprehensive approach, really looking at the entire life cycle from the get-go.
That sounds pretty thorough. Thinking about reuse right at the start, tracking reductions. What about other places in Europe?
Well, Germany has its assessment system for sustainable building, known as B&B. This system includes specific evaluation standards for the global warming potential, the GWP of office buildings, and it provides indicative values for other building types. It gives a framework for assessment.
A framework, okay. Different from London's mandatory reporting.
Slightly different focus, yeah. And then in France, their RE 2020 regulation takes another tack. It sets actual carbon emission thresholds for various building types, houses, apartments, offices, schools.
So hard limits.
Yes, specific targets expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square meter. So very clear, measurable limits that new buildings have to meet.
So we've got mandatory reporting, assessment frameworks, hard emission limits. It seems different places are finding different regulatory levers to pull.
Exactly. It reflects different contexts, different priorities, maybe different levels of market readiness.
When these regulations are in place, how do they actually check if buildings are complying? Is it all done at the design stage, or do they wait until the building is finished?
Well, there are different philosophies on that too. Some places, like Denmark, France, and Sweden, primarily require the submission of the final assessment results once the building is actually completed.
After the fact.
Yeah, the argument being it allows for a more accurate accounting based on the actual materials used in construction methods.
Okay, makes sense for accuracy.
However, cities like Helsinki in Finland and Greater London, as we mentioned, take a more proactive approach. They require submissions at multiple stages, including during the design phase.
Ah, intervening earlier.
Right. The idea is that this early stage oversight can be more effective in actually encouraging low carbon design choices right from the start, rather than just measuring the impact at the end.
So it's a bit of a trade-off, isn't it, between getting the most accurate final numbers versus having more influence over the design decisions that ultimately determine those numbers?
Exactly that. There's a balance to be struck there.
Interesting. Now, earlier you mentioned this idea of an enabling environment for these policies. What are the really key elements that need to be in place to make these whole-life carbon policies actually work effectively on a large scale? It's not just about the regulation itself, right?
Not at all. Several interconnected elements are absolutely crucial. The first one is having a robust and agreed-upon methodology.
The how-to guide.
Precisely. We need standardized and widely accepted ways to measure the energy and environmental performance of buildings across their entire life cycle. Many countries and cities are basing their methodologies on established international standards like ISO 21130 or European standards like EN 15978.
So building on existing standards helps.
Definitely. And developing these methodologies often involves pilot projects and close collaboration between government agencies, academic institutions, and the private sector, the industry, to make sure they're practical and relevant locally. Japan's JCAT tool, which was developed through a public-private partnership, is a good example. And in Sweden, Boverket, their National Board of Housing, Building, and Planning, plays a key role in developing their methodology. Having that consistent, agreed-upon way to measure is absolutely foundational.
Foundational. Okay, so a solid methodology first. What else is in this enabling environment toolkit?
Defining clear system boundaries is also key.
System boundaries.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean in this context?
It essentially means deciding which stages of a building's life are going to be included in the carbon assessment. Are we just looking at the emissions from making and transporting the materials? That's often called upfront carbon. Or are we also including the construction process itself? What about operational energy use during its life, maintenance, repairs, replacements, and even what happens at the end of the building's life demolition, waste processing, potential recycling?
Wow, that's a lot of stages. Modules A, B, C, D in the standards, right?
Exactly, those life cycle modules. Different countries and cities prioritize different scopes based on their specific goals and how mature their assessment methods are. For instance, Sweden initially focused heavily on modules A1 to A5, the upfront carbon from materials and construction,
Right.
whereas Singapore aims for a broader scope covering more of the life cycle. The minimum scope usually includes the product stage, A1, A3, the construction stage, A4, A5, and often parts of the use stage, B, and end of life. Understanding precisely what you're measuring is essential for meaningful comparisons and effective policy.
Right, you need to know exactly what's in the calculation and what's out. Apples to apples.
No.
What about the time frame we're considering? Buildings can stand for, 50, 100 years or more. How do you compare their impacts fairly?
That's where the concept of the reference study period, or RSP, comes into play.
RSP.
This is the standard number of years over which the environmental impacts of a building are assessed and annualized. Using a fixed RSP allows for consistent benchmarking and comparison between different projects. For instance, both Denmark and France have adopted a standard RSP of 50 years for their regulations.
50 years seems common.
It's a pragmatic choice for many. And the reference unit used for the assessment is also important for comparability. Are you measuring the impact per square meter of gross floor area, GFA, or heated floor area, HFA, or useful floor area, UFA?
Different ways to measure the size.
Exactly. And they can give different results depending on the building type. The EU seems to be increasingly moving towards using the useful floor area, UFA, as a standard to try and ensure more consistent comparisons across different building types and uses.
Okay, so consistency in both the time frame, the RSP, and the unit of measurement like UFA is crucial for making fair comparisons and tracking progress over time.
Got it. Now, this might sound a bit technical, but it comes up a lot with timber construction. What about the carbon that's stored in wood and other natural plant-based materials? Biogenic carbon, how is that accounted for?
Yes. That's a really interesting and actually quite actively debated area in WLC assessment. There isn't one single universally agreed approach.
Oh, what are the main ways people handle it?
Well, some methodologies take what's called a 0-0-0 approach, essentially. They ignore both the carbon absorbed by the plant as it grew and the carbon released when the material eventually decays or is burned at end of life. It cancels out, in effect.
Okay, simplest maybe, but maybe not fully accurate.
Some argue that. Others use a -1+1 approach. They account for the carbon uptake during the product stage, a negative emission or sequestration, and then account for its release at the end of life, a positive emission.
So it counts the temporary storage. Yes. And then some, like France's dynamic LCA methodology used in their RE 2020 regulation, go even further.
Dynamic LCA, how does that work?
It weights the climate impacts based on when the emissions occur. It recognizes that emissions released sooner have a more immediate impact on global warming than emissions released, say, 50 years down the line.
Timing matters.
Exactly. This dynamic approach acknowledges the temporary storage of carbon in biogenic materials, but also accounts for its eventual release. And importantly, when it's released, giving a more nuanced picture of the climate impact over time.
Dynamic LCA, that sounds like a pretty sophisticated way of thinking about it. Timing is everything, huh? Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Let's talk about the raw data that underpins all these assessments. Where does all the environmental information about different building materials actually come from? You mentioned EPDs earlier.
That's right. Environmental databases are absolutely essential. Several countries have invested heavily in developing their own national databases, like Finland's CO2data.fi France has the INES database. Germany has Ökobaudat. And the Netherlands has the National Milieu Database, or NMD.
So national efforts to collect this data.
Yes. And these databases contain standardized environmental information for a wide range of building materials and construction processes. Often, this data is based on detailed environmental product declarations, or EPDs.
EPDs. Explain those quickly.
Sure. An EPD is basically a standardized, verified document that provides transparent data about the environmental impacts of a product throughout its life cycle, including its carbon footprint. Think of it like a nutrition label, but for environmental impact.
Okay, a standardized eco-label.
Essentially, yes. Now, there's an ongoing discussion about whether policies should primarily rely on these curated national databases, which helps ensure consistency and quality control,
Right.
or whether they should allow for broader access to EPDs from the global market, which could offer more choice, but maybe less consistency.
Tricky balance.
It is. And the significant hurdle right now, as mentioned in the survey challenges, is the current limited availability of EPD data for many, many building materials, especially locally specific ones.
So how are countries tackling that, getting more EPDs made?
They're employing various strategies to incentivize manufacturers to actually invest in creating EPDs for their products. For example, the Netherlands has implemented a surcharge on products without EPDs in their database.
Stick approach.
Denmark offers subsidies to manufacturers to help cover the cost of getting an EPD.
A carrot.
And France is prioritizing products with EPDs in public procurement processes. So different ways to nudge the market, but everyone agrees reliable data, largely from EPDs, is absolutely the backbone of credible whole-life carbon assessments.
Okay, so reliable data is the backbone, and we need more of it, particularly EPDs. There are different strategies being used to ensure its quality and availability. What about the actual software and tools that professionals, the architects, engineers use to conduct these complex assessments?
Good question. Several countries have supported the development of national assessment tools to help standardize the process and make it easier for practitioners. Denmark has LCABIG, Germany has ELCA.
So government-backed tools.
Often, yes, or government-endorsed. In France, they took a slightly different approach. Rather than developing a single national tool, they have a system for pre-approving various commercial software tools to ensure they meet the specific requirements for compliance with the RE 2020 regulation.
Gives the market some choice, but ensures quality.
Exactly. And the integration of digital tools like Building Information Modeling, or BIM, is also becoming increasingly important in this field.
BIM. How does that help with WLC?
Well, BIM creates a digital model of the building that contains detailed information about its geometry, materials, components, basically everything.
Right, the digital twin idea.
Kind of. By having all that data centralized in the BIM model, you can link it to environmental databases and automate large parts of the whole life carbon assessment. It makes it much faster, less prone to manual error, and easier to compare different design options early on.
So BIM could be a real game changer for making WLC assessment mainstream.
Potentially, yes. And we're seeing initiatives in countries like France with their Plan BIM, Japan through their BIM Acceleration Project, and Finland, which now mandates the use of the Open IFC file format for BIM data in public projects, all aimed at promoting the adoption of BIM and these digital workflows for sustainability assessments.
It sounds like technology is playing an absolutely crucial role in making these assessments more efficient, more accurate, and maybe less burdensome.
Definitely. But it's not just about having the right tools. People need to know how to use them effectively, right? You mentioned the skills gap earlier.
Absolutely. Training and education must be vital for the widespread adoption of WLC assessment. Are we seeing efforts there?
Yes, definitely. The report highlights examples of targeted training programs being developed and implemented for industry professionals and also for local government officials who need to understand and enforce these policies.
Where are some examples?
Denmark has their VCBK platform for voluntary sustainability classes. Sweden has an online platform run by Boverket. France offers a MOEC, a massive open online course, specifically on RE 2020, and Canada has programs like the one at the British Columbia Institute of Technology, BCIT.
So dedicated training is emerging.
Yes, and beyond formal education, financial incentives can also play a big role in driving change. Vancouver's Near Zero program, for instance, offers subsidies for projects that achieve very low carbon emissions.
Money talks again.
And voluntary certifications are important too. Things like Denmark's Sustainability Class for buildings, Germany's Sustainable Building Quality Seal, QNG, and France's Low Carbon Building Initiative, LCBI. These often act as preparatory steps, getting the market ready for future mandatory requirements and recognizing the leaders.
So it's a whole ecosystem, isn't it? Regulation, data, tools, skills, incentives, voluntary schemes, all working together ideally.
That's the goal. It's a mix of providing the right skills and knowledge and creating market demand for lower carbon buildings through both sticks and carrots and recognition.
Okay. Now, one of the big concepts we hear a lot about these days, relevant to materials especially, is the circular economy. How does that fit into this whole life carbon picture for buildings?
It fits in perfectly. The principles of a circular economy, which, are all about designing out waste and pollution, keeping materials and products in use for as long as possible at their highest value, and regenerating natural systems are incredibly relevant to the building sector and directly contribute to reducing whole life carbon.
How so? Specifically for buildings?
Well, in this context, it means prioritizing the reuse of existing buildings first and foremost, renovation over demolition.
Right. The most sustainable building is often the one already standing.
Exactly. Then it's about reusing building components, salvaging beams, bricks, fixtures. Minimizing waste during both construction and demolition is key, and designing new buildings in a way that makes them easier to disassemble later on so their materials can be recovered and reused in the future. Designed for disassembly.
So, thinking about the end of life right from the beginning.
Precisely. And we're seeing regulations being introduced that actually mandate the reuse of certain materials. Standards are being developed for voluntary circular economy initiatives in construction. And some really interesting practical projects are popping up.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, France has its AGEC law, anti-waste for a circular economy, which includes requirements for diagnosing products, equipment, materials, and waste before demolition. The MDPE diagnosis to identify reusable elements. Paris is developing a circular economy certification specifically for construction projects.
A city-level certification.
Yes. And Vancouver has its green demolition bylaw pushing for waste diversion. And they've established a rebuild hub, which is a physical place aiming to divert reusable building materials from landfill. Malmö in Sweden has established reconstruction depots or bygdepån to facilitate the storage and reuse of salvaged building materials.
Practical infrastructure for reuse.
Exactly. And at the EU level, the revised Construction Products Regulation, CPR, and the upcoming Digital Product Passport, DPP, are crucial pieces here.
How will they help circularity?
They aim to provide much more comprehensive, digitized data on the life cycle performance and composition of building materials. This enhances transparency and makes it much easier to identify materials suitable for reuse or high-value recycling.
More data, better decisions for circularity.
Exactly. And some groups are even developing specific metrics, like Norway's Future Built program, which has created a circularity index to help assess and promote circular practices in projects. It's clear that moving towards a more circular model for our buildings is a absolutely key strategy for reducing their overall environmental impact, especially the embodied carbon part.
And it sounds like it connects to that idea of sufficiency, too.
Absolutely. It's not just about recycling more efficiently at the end. The concept of sufficiency is gaining traction, which means really thinking hard. Do we even need to build new in the first place? Can we adapt, renovate, or intensify the use of existing buildings instead?
Prioritizing reuse and retrofit first.
Exactly. Initiatives like Greater London's Circular Economy Hierarchy explicitly puts refurbishment and reuse above new build. Oslo has developed guidelines for circular economy and construction projects that emphasize this, and Glasgow has been making efforts to repurpose existing buildings rather than demolishing them. It reflects this important shift in thinking, using less, using what we have better.
It sounds like we're moving beyond just making new buildings efficient to really rethinking the entire life cycle of the materials themselves and, crucially, prioritizing reuse and sufficiency over constant new construction. Okay, we've talked a lot about national level policies and frameworks, but the report also puts quite a spotlight on what's happening at the city level. It seems like many cities are really stepping up and, in some cases, taking the lead on whole life carbon.
That's absolutely right. The report makes it clear that in many cases, cities are proving to be real engines of change, implementing ambitious whole-life carbon policies, sometimes even before national regulations catch up.
Why do you think cities are often out front?
Well, they're often closer to the impacts of climate change, they have more direct control over local planning and building regulations, and they can sometimes be more nimble and responsive than national governments. Take Tampere in Finland, for example.
What are they doing in Tampere?
They now require companies leasing public land to provide climate declarations, and they mandate carbon footprint assessments for all public construction projects. Crucially, they make the carbon impact a key design selection criterion.
So carbon footprint weighs heavily in deciding which project gets built.
Exactly. Their Hayden-Rannon School and Daycare Center initiative is a great illustration. They conducted really detailed comparisons of different design scenarios based on both cost and carbon footprint to make genuinely informed decisions. They're using carbon impact as a tangible decision-making tool at the city level.
So they're not just measuring it, they're actually using the carbon footprint data to guide their choices in city development. That sounds powerful. What other cities are highlighted as leaders?
Malmö in Sweden has the LFM30 platform. It's a really interesting public-private partnership with incredibly ambitious goals.
LFM30, what are they aiming for?
They're aiming for climate neutrality in the entire construction sector locally by 2030. That includes mandating the use of environmentally friendly electricity on sites and achieving climate neutrality across all life cycle stages of construction projects, going well beyond current national requirements in Sweden.
Wow, 2030 climate neutral construction sector. That's ambitious.
Very. Greater London, as we discussed, has also been a leader, particularly in their extensive engagement of stakeholders industry, community groups, in developing their comprehensive WLC policies, which are now embedded in the London Plan.
And outside Europe?
In North America, Vancouver in Canada stands out. They have a climate emergency action plan with a significant target, a 40% reduction in embodied carbon in new buildings by 2030 compared to a 2018 baseline.
40% by 2030. How are they doing that?
They've updated their Vancouver Building Bylaw, the VBBL, to require the calculation and reduction of embodied carbon for large new buildings. So regulation is key there.
Okay. Any examples from Asia?
Yes. The report mentions Tokyo is planning to expand its building environmental labeling program in 2025. The interesting part is they plan to include an upfront carbon assessment as an incentive for developers. So, not mandatory yet, but rewarding those who do it.
Using labeling as a driver. Interesting. So it sounds like these leading cities often share some key characteristics.
They do. They tend to set ambitious, clear targets. They actively involve a wide range of stakeholders in the process, getting buy-in and leveraging local knowledge. And they use the levers of control they have locally, like planning rules, public land management, and building bylaws, to really push the boundaries of what's possible.
So ambition, collaboration, and using local powers effectively. Now, you've touched on the relationship between national and city-level policies. How important is this multi-level governance, this interaction, for really driving progress on whole life carbon across the board?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial. The report emphasizes this strongly. Effective policy implementation in this complex area really requires strong vertical coordination between national and subnational governments, cities, regions, etc.
Vertical coordination, meaning they need to work together smoothly.
Yes. If there are significant disparities or inconsistencies between local measures and national frameworks, it can create real challenges, especially for those ambitious cities trying to go faster. It can lead to confusion, duplication of effort, or even hold back progress.
So it's not enough for cities to just act in isolation. There needs to be alignment and ideally support from the national level to create a consistent and effective overall framework. Can you give an example of where this kind of vertical coordination has worked well?
Well, the report mentions the example of Canada potentially adapting Vancouver's pioneering embodied carbon guidelines for national use.
So the city innovation informs national policy.
Exactly. When cities act as test beds and pioneer innovative approaches, national governments can learn from their experiences, see what works, and potentially scale up those successful models. It's a valuable feedback loop.
Makes sense. What other ways can national government support cities?
Financial support is one key way. Like Canada's Codes Acceleration Fund, which helps provinces and territories adopt more stringent building codes, including those related to emissions. And facilitating knowledge sharing between different levels of government is also really important, creating platforms for cities and national bodies to talk and learn from each other.
Okay, so vertical coordination is key, national supporting and learning from local. What about collaboration between different regions or cities that might be facing similar challenges? Horizontal collaboration, is that also important?
Absolutely. Horizontal collaboration across subnational governments can be very beneficial. They can share best practices, pool resources, learn from each other's mistakes and successes, and accelerate progress collectively.
Any examples of that?
Networks like Sweden's Climate Municipalities, Network Climate Kommunerna are a great example. Local authorities come together specifically to share knowledge and strategies for tackling climate change, including in the built environment. creates a powerful peer-to-peer learning environment.
Peer pressure and peer support.
Exactly. And similarly, horizontal collaboration across different ministries and agencies at the national level is also essential. Tackling WLC isn't just an environment issue or an energy issue. It involves industry, housing, finance.
Right? It cuts across silos.
It really does. So mechanisms like Japan's interministerial liaison meeting on zero-carbon city promotion are important to ensure a joined-up, coherent approach across the whole of government.
And internationally, collaboration between countries.
Yes, that's vital too. Initiatives like the Nordic Sustainable Construction Program, which aims to harmonize building regulations and WLC methodologies across the Nordic countries, are really valuable for driving consistency, sharing data, and raising ambition across the board. We need more of that international alignment.
So it sounds like collaboration is needed everywhere, vertically between levels, horizontally between peers and ministries, and even internationally. What about the role of partnerships that involve organizations outside of government, like businesses, industry associations, universities, research institutes?
Yes. Public-private academic partnerships are absolutely essential. The report really underscores their importance for driving innovation and scaling up solutions in the built environment.
Why are they so critical?
Because these collaborations bring together diverse expertise, different perspectives, and crucial resources that no single sector possesses on its own. Government sets the direction, industry knows the practicalities, academia provides research and data. You need all three.
Can you give some examples of these partnerships in action?
Sure. Brazil's SIDAC platform, which is a system for information and monitoring of civil construction works involving government and industry, is one example. Japan's Zero Carbon Building Promotion Committee, bringing together various stakeholders, is another.
And they help with things like training, too.
Definitely. They can play a crucial role in developing and delivering training and education programs. Initiatives like Skills for Reuse, which focuses specifically on building skills for material reuse in the construction sector, often involve these kinds of partnerships. The Singapore Green Building Council Digital Academy is another example.
So partnerships are key for innovation, for implementation, for skills.
And for building trust and shared understanding. Ultimately, the report stresses the need to clearly define the roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders through really inclusive engagement processes. The development process for the Netherlands NMD environmental database is often cited as a good example of a robust partnership that built consensus and clarity. Getting everyone on the same page is key for long-term success.
Okay, so we've covered a tremendous amount of ground here: the urgency of shifting to whole life carbon, the evolving global policy landscape, specific examples of regulations, and all those enabling factors like data and tools, the crucial leadership role of cities, and the absolute necessity of collaboration and partnerships at all levels. Now, bringing it all together, what are the really key actionable policy recommendations that emerge from this OECD report? What should policymakers be focusing on to really accelerate this transition?
The report distills it down into several key recommendations. Firstly, and perhaps most fundamentally, it stresses the urgent need to expand the policy focus beyond just operational carbon emissions, to truly encompass the entire life cycle of buildings, the whole life carbon perspective.
Get the full picture.
Exactly. Especially given the rapid pace of urbanization we discussed, particularly in regions like Africa and Asia. We need policies that address both the immediate challenge of reducing embodied carbon and the longer-term goal of improving operational efficiency. They're two sides of the same coin.
That makes perfect sense. You can't really solve the problem effectively by only looking at half of it. Okay, what's the next key recommendation?
The report suggests that countries and cities should develop customized, step-by-step approaches when creating and implementing their WLC policies.
Not a one-size-fits-all approach, then.
No. It means implementing changes in phases, setting clear timelines and measurable goals along the way. It suggests starting by targeting the areas with the biggest impact, maybe certain building types or life cycle stages, and categorizing different types of buildings to set tailored, realistic benchmarks.
Phased and tailored. Any examples?
Examples like France's phased implementation of their RE 2020 regulation, with thresholds tightening over time, and Denmark's gradual strengthening of building regulations illustrate how this kind of structured, progressive approach can work effectively. It's about starting with what matters most and building capacity and momentum over time, not trying to boil the ocean immediately.
Okay, so a tailored and phased approach, focusing on high-impact areas first.
Makes sense.
What about those data challenges we kept coming back to?
Right. The third key recommendation is squarely focused on that. Develop robust data collection strategies.
What does that involve?
This includes actively incentivizing manufacturers to obtain and publish those crucial environmental product declarations, EPDs, for their materials. We need more EPDs. It also means developing digital platforms to make sharing and accessing this data easier for everyone. And learning from existing data management systems like the reporting template used in Greater London to create effective and user-friendly solutions. Good, accessible data is absolutely fundamental.
Better data, better policies, better buildings, crucial. What about the role of technology like BIM in all of this?
That's the next recommendation. Use digital tools more effectively.
Go digital.
Yes, the report strongly recommends developing comprehensive and standardized databases of environmental information linking back to the previous point. It encourages incentivizing the adoption of building information modeling, BIM, to streamline WLC assessments, and fostering collaborative partnerships specifically for developing and improving user-friendly assessment tools. Technology can significantly enhance the efficiency, accuracy, and accessibility of whole-life carbon assessments.
Technology as an enabler, not just a calculation tool. Okay. What about the coordination between different levels of government that you highlighted?
Enhancing vertical coordination is another critical recommendation. National governments really need to step up and establish coherent policy frameworks that provide clear direction and avoid conflicting signals.
So national leadership is key.
Yes, but also providing support and resources to cities and regions to help them implement policies effectively, and actively leveraging cities as valuable test beds for innovative approaches, learning from their experiences, as we discussed with Vancouver and Canada. A supportive national framework is essential for empowering effective local action and scaling up success.
So a supportive national framework that empowers local innovation and action. And finally, what about all those partnerships we talked about earlier? Collaboration seems to be a running theme.
It absolutely is. The final key recommendation is to strengthen horizontal collaboration at all levels,
Horizontal.
meaning collaboration between different government bodies at the same level, like city networks, collaboration across different ministries and agencies within national governments, and strengthening international cooperation between countries. And crucially, fostering those robust public-private academic partnerships to facilitate knowledge sharing along policies, build capacity, and drive innovation across the entire built environment value chain.
Huh.
Working together is absolutely essential for accelerating the transition to a whole-life carbon approach. It cannot be done in silos.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive and logical set of recommendations. It seems to address the various challenges and opportunities we've discussed throughout this deep dive. So just to recap for everyone listening, this has really highlighted just how vital it is to broaden our focus in the building sector. We need to move beyond just operational energy use to the much wider, more complete picture of whole life carbon emissions.
Absolutely critical shift.
We've explored the really diverse and rapidly evolving approaches being taken by different countries and cities around the globe, from London to Malmö to Vancouver. We've acknowledged the significant challenges that definitely still need to be overcome, particularly around data, skills, and consistent methodologies.
Yes, challenges remain.
And we've underscored the absolutely crucial role that collaboration, vertical, horizontal, public-private, and innovative policy tools, including digital ones, will play in actually moving towards a truly zero-carbon-built environment. It's clear that understanding this complex field is no longer just a niche interest for specialists. It's becoming fundamental to how we think about and shape our future cities and buildings.
Exactly. Hopefully this deep dive has provided a valuable shortcut, a way to quickly grasp the key aspects of this critically important and fast-moving issue.
I think it definitely has. And on that note, here's a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Given these global trends we've discussed and the increasing momentum behind whole-life carbon thinking in the building sector, what are the potential implications for your own decisions and actions?
Yeah, how does it affect you?
Whether you're a policymaker grappling with how to draft new regulations, a developer planning your next project, an architect or engineer designing for a truly sustainable future, or maybe simply someone interested in creating a more environmentally responsible world. What role can you play in promoting and implementing a whole-life carbon approach to buildings?
Everyone has a role.
We really encourage you to delve deeper into the OECD report we've been discussing today and to explore the many fascinating examples of innovation and leadership that are emerging all around the world. The shift towards whole-life carbon isn't just a fleeting trend. It feels like a fundamental, necessary change in how we need to think about, design, build, and operate our built environment. And everyone really does have a role to play in making that change a reality.